What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, the series in which I give you an appetizer sample or glimpse into a particular faction in 40k. The goal behind this is to help you decide if you want to look further into that force on your own, or maybe even start collecting that force as well. So up on the chopping block this time, by viewer request, is the Death Specters Space Marine chapter. It is a successor of the Raven Guard, it's a loyalist chapter, and was founded in the Dark Founding, which is the 13th founding. So the chapter has gotten some fluff recently, and relatively recently, added to it, which is always good. But I'm going to be very brief on all of it. I'm not going to go into their special terms for chapter master and chief librarian and all that. If you're really interested in the chapter, you can look further into it, like I mentioned in the intro, and discover those for yourself. But they do have, I will tell you now, some unique terms for ranks in their chapter. So, being founded in the Dark Founding, the 13th Founding, is kind of cool, and they're founded alongside the Exorcists, for example, so that's interesting. And they're founded with a particular purpose, although they do act like a normal Space Marine chapter, and that purpose primarily is to maintain a vigil over the Ghoul Stars. There is a dangerous Xenos species that was pushed back to the Ghoul Stars that must not be allowed to plague the galaxy again. So they maintain a vigil over the Ghoul Stars, but even still, they act like a Space Marine chapter. They participated in the Macarian Crusade, they participated in the 13th Flat Crusade, they fought against Tyranid Hive Fleet stuff, so they're pretty well versed. They still act like a normal chapter. But it's an interesting purpose of founding, so that's cool. Now, being called Death Specters, they actually do have a veneration for the dead. They have a very somber way that they pay respects and venerate the dead. It's more along the lines of how Star Phantoms do it, and less like how Mortifactors do it. So, just some comparison for you. It's interesting, for living heroes, they give you some leeway. It's like, you get a pass, you're alive, we understand all the great things you've done, we give you some respect for it because it's due, you definitely are doing good. But once you die, we'll venerate you. So it's kind of interesting. I find that kind of interesting, at least myself. So they have that kind of way that they do things as a chapter. And with that said, they also have an interesting kind of setup. They're a chapter that relies heavily on librarians. In fact, librarian stuff is basically their leadership. They have captains, they have chaplains, but ultimately of the chapter running, it's librarians who run it. Their chapter master is a psyker. Their chief librarian kind of is the de facto leader for the chapter master, and I'll explain why very briefly in a moment. And the chapter council assists the chief librarian in running the chapter. So what's interesting is their original chapter master took his oath of fealty and whatnot in front of the emperor himself at the foot of the golden throne, and received a vision while doing so. This vision led to the discovery of the throne of glass. And this is where the chapter master and subsequent chapter masters basically submit themselves for the rest of their lives. They sit upon the throne of glass and they never leave it, basically. For the most part, basically. They cease to become a active combatant, and they basically rule the chapter in title only. They rarely communicate with their own chapter, and only communicate with key members of their chapter when they do so. So kind of becomes like a imitation of the emperor in that respect you could say. And while it's an ultimate mystery on what the Throne of Glass actually does, we do know it slowly drains the life force of the chapter master and will kill them, and they sit upon that throne until they do die. And it's thought to augment their psychic capabilities for maybe better maintaining vigil over the Ghoul Stars, or supporting their chapter in some way, or helping with their Living Chalice Great Resurrection type of prophecy stuff. But ultimately it's kind of a mystery from what I can understand, and I did not have the time or the capability to read their little publication thing, so I don't really know too much more on it. But what my understanding is that it's still a mystery. It's a little bit ambiguous what the Throne of Glass ultimately is doing for the chapter. All it is known is that this was a vision received from the emperor, so it's pretty important, and the chapter masters dedicate their very existence to sitting upon the golden throne until they die. And typically as a chief librarian, from what I did with research, that steps up to the new role of chapter master and sits upon the throne of glass. So it's a very interesting setup. So this is why they have a chapter council with the de facto leader being the chief librarian. So that's the setup for this chapter. Again, pretty interesting, pretty different from other chapters. Their combat style, however, isn't something where it's like you must use Psychers or you're not playing Death Specters. Obviously, they have a reliance on Psychers, but they still have captains and chaplains, and they basically fight like Raven Guard fight. Stealth raids, covert strikes, things of that nature is what they prefer to do. So, if you enjoy the Raven Guard style of play, if you enjoy Psychers, a combination thereof, perhaps, you'll definitely have a potential interest in pursuing Death Specters, let's say, as your Space Marine chapter, if you're looking to collect one. So with that said, let's talk about color scheme first. Color scheme is crucial. You could like their name, you could like their style of play, you could like their fluff, but their color scheme might just be silly to you. Not necessarily for this chapter, but I mean in general, right? So you have to like the way they look as well. And I think that the Death Specters have a simple but effective look. It's very clean, looks very good, and you've been looking at it. It's predominantly black armor, with their helmet and chest emblem being bone white. If they display company color, it's on their knee pad. Their left shoulder pad instead is white. They use white squad markings, and their chapter symbol sits on that white background. It's a skull that has two crossed black scythes behind it. Very fitting for the Death Specters. Simple yet effective. If you're worried about doing black armor, because some people just have trouble with black armor, which is fine, my one recommendation is to base coat all the black parts in a dark gray first, and then do several thin washes of a black wash over it until you get to the shade, the darkness you like in your black that fits for you. Meaning you don't have to go till everything's black and you can't see any gray anymore. You just do it until it appeals to you, and you're going to have a very dark black to gray type of fade going almost naturally, and you really don't have to do anything else on top of that unless you want to. So that's my recommendation there to help alleviate the stress of doing black armor, because some people find black difficult to do. And you know, I've heard plenty of people say that, so that's my one recommendation. That's how I like to do black, because it's simple, it's quick, and it looks pretty sharp once you're done with it. So anyways, with that said, let's talk about collecting them. First things first, the codex in question is definitely the Space Marine Codex. The regular Space Marine Codex is the way to go with the Raven Guard chapter tactics, since that's how they fight, and they are Raven Guard successors. Keep in mind, going back to their look real quick before I continue forward, being Raven Guard successors, they have the same gene seed mutation, so they still get that sickly, gray, pale skin look with black eyes and jet black hair, very fitting for their name of Death Specters. So keep that in mind if you're going to do any unhelmeted guys. So anyways, back to talking about the Codex and whatnot. The Raven Guard do have their own supplemental book, and the Angels of Death supplemental book is also out. So if any of that strikes your fancy with the Raven Guard chapter tactics, go for it, right? That might help you out further, get the army list to fit your playstyle and its playstyle, and your army list to fit what you wanted to do. You don't need either supplement to play, but it is out there if you so desire. So there is that to keep in mind. But ultimately, just a regular Space Marine Codex with the Raven Guard chapter tactics, and you'll be just fine. Keep in mind, there is no chapter master to fight in battles anymore. The chapter master, who is also a librarian, but that's a whole different can of worms, is a non-combatant now. But they still have captains and the like, so if you really want to run the chapter master stat line, you could just say first company captain, utilize that stat line. He's their mightiest hero, or mightiest warrior, you could say, so he has a chapter master type stat line. That works fine. You don't really have to justify yourself to the opponent anyway, because you're running everything fine, but just keep that in mind yourself, especially considering also their chapter leadership tends to be psychers, so it tends to be their librarians. Unfortunately, that means you're not going to be able to make use of accounts as Tigerius, because he's a really good psyker that would fit in pretty well here, but you can make use of normal librarians and still do just fine, since you're using the Raven Guard chapter tactics. And also, you don't need any Psychers Union Force if you don't want it. It's just something that they do have a reliance on, so it definitely would make sense to have librarians everywhere if you are a librarian fan. But they still have chaplains and captains and all that. So with that said, they follow very closely the Codex Astartes, so there's no other restrictions you have to place upon yourself to be very much in line with their fluff. Everything else works just fine. From there, collecting them is also relatively straightforward for the most part. Any generic kit from GW or Forge World, 30k or 40k, will work for them. That's the nice thing about Space Marines. All of the regular kits work just fine for basically any Space Marine chapter, Death Specters included. Their chapter symbols where it gets a little bit finicky, and it's a weird situation. Here in the States, on GW's website, there is no Death Specters decal sheet. On the UK website, and maybe some other websites as well for GW, you will find a decal sheet for the Death Specters. And if you have access to it, I recommend purchasing it for their chapter symbol. The weird thing is that, for whatever reason, they made the squad markings black, which doesn't make sense considering how the Death Specters look, because their shoulder pad for the squad markings is black already. So they are shown by GW as well as having white squad markings. So I'm not really sure what went on there, but the symbol works just fine, and I definitely would recommend it just for that. Now, if your GW site doesn't have it on there, you could always go to a site like eBay or some third-party site, and chances are you might be able to find that decal sheet for sale and get it shipped to you that way. So that's another way of doing it. If that doesn't work for you, or you just can't find it, if you're comfortable with the whole process of printing decal sheets on printing your own decals on decal sheets with your printer, printing it out and then sealing it and whatnot, I recommend transparent decal paper, and you can definitely find Death Specters symbol out there to download and print on decal paper. And since it's going on a white background, it'll look just fine, and you can definitely go ahead and do it that way if you're comfortable doing that. If not, you still have yet another option, and that is freehanding either the entire symbol or making use of a smaller skull symbol or a sculpted skull and then just freehanding the sights. So there's multiple avenues to get this chapter symbol, which is good. I mean, technically you could say there's multiple avenues for a lot of chapter symbols out there, but considering this relatively unique chapter symbol that isn't just going to be found anywhere, at the very least you can make use of skulls that you can find third party or even in other GW decal sheets and whatnot. And as long as you find one that's bone colored and small enough, you can do the sights freehand behind it. So there's a lot of different avenues to get to the Death Specter symbol. So that's good. And it's basically always going to be on a white background, so you can freehand it on vehicles or do what have you, and you'll be just fine. So that is just food for thought in terms of their symbol. Outside of that, not much else to say. All the generic Space Marine bits and kits are going to work just fine for you. But it's a cool chapter that has a bit of a different style to their hierarchy and a interesting founding purpose, maintaining vigil over the Ghoul Stars, and being a Raven Guard successor has that cool quirk of a look for their flesh and hair and all that. So can lead to a very nice visually striking force, even though their color scheme isn't that crazy or super unique. It's clean and efficient and effective, and that's always good too, and I like it. So that's the Death Specters in a nutshell-ish type of thing. Hopefully I made some sense there in my ramblings. Yeah, that's basically it for the Death Specters. I would say, in short, if you're a Raven Guard fan, a Psyker fan, a Jump Pack fan, or any mix thereof, you can definitely find a place with the Death Specters as your Space Marine force if you're looking to collect one. So anyways, that's basically it. Thanks for sticking through it, and until next time, take it easy.